Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Human Rights Council announced the formation of a commission to study possible war crimes during Israel's military action in Gaza, known as Operation Protective Edge. When they named a Canadian professor, William Shabbos, a genocide scholar and well-known critic of Israel, to head the commission, red flags immediately went up. Imagine the outcry if the UN appointed a staunch supporter of Israel to head the commission instead of a bitter critic. Shabbos is coming into this thing with his prejudices well honed. He has said that he thinks the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu should be in the dock of the International Court. So before he even started, he had settled on his conclusion. He thinks Netanyahu should be tried for war crimes. The United Nations chose the result of the investigation the moment they chose his leader. Shabbos says he's coming into this with an open mind, then illustrated it with this statement. It's very hard to make accurate assessments about war crimes without having the story from both sides. How open can your mind be if you've already decided that war crimes have been committed? Then he said, there's a very real possibility now of the International Criminal Court being involved or being engaged in this. The commission will examine as much as we can get of the information that's available, as much as we can get on the ground, and analyze the facts and make recommendations so that there's accountability on this. So Shabbos has already decided that there have been war crimes and that the International Criminal Court should be involved. But don't worry, he's keeping an open mind, of course. John Baird, Canada's foreign minister, made the obvious point: you can't spend several years calling for the prosecution of someone and then suddenly act as his judge. It's absurd and a violation of the minimal rules of due process applicable to UN fact-finding missions. He's exactly right. Shabbos said he hoped the commission could contribute to a little more peace and justice in the region. But that's the problem. It can't. In fact, it will do just the opposite. It gives the people of Gaza a sense that the terrorist organization which leads them, Hamas, is doing a good job. It makes them think that terrorist violence against Israel is working because it's gaining them a sympathetic world hearing. That encourages them to continue doing the things that categorically cannot bring peace. Anything that encourages them to keep fighting to destroy Israel only keeps them in poverty and pain. The commission's findings are predictable. To make it seem balanced, they'll find fault on both sides. Then they'll spend the rest of the report excoriating Israel. When the UN first announced that it was forming a commission, before it was announced that Shabbos would lead it, the Israeli Foreign Ministry said, the report has already been written, and the only question is, who signs it? Now we know. Last week, we were all stunned by the news that Robin Williams was found dead at his home in Tiburon, California. The beloved actor and comedian died by his own hand. Williams seemed to have everything anyone could want: a lovely family, lots of money, celebrity, the respect and love of his peers, and an enormous, almost unimaginable level of talent. So what happened? We know he struggled with addiction, was in the beginning stages of Parkinson's disease, and had heart problems. Now, any one of those can lead to severe depression. We also know that depression, even to the point of suicide, is all too common in this fast-paced era in which we live. According to the Centers for Disease Control, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. On an average day in America, 100 people commit suicide. More people die of suicide than die in car crashes. The number of suicides actually declined in the first part of this century, but exploded in the last few years, especially among the baby boomers. Last year, the Washington Post asked, how did a generation that started out with so much going for it end up so despondent in midlife? Suicide rates among active duty and retired military personnel are also at a record level. But what troubles me the most is that many Christians are falling into bouts of depression too. What is the main cause of this among Christians and even pastors? I remember that as a new Christian, I suffered some terrible periods of depression. After experiencing some wonderful periods of joy after I received Christ as my Savior, I began to fall under periods of depression for about 2 years. Finally, I prayed that the Lord would show me what was wrong. How could I learn to walk with Him in a growing peace and sense of purpose? How could I do His will and perform His plan for my life? Shortly after this prayer, a friend of mine took me to a Bible study taught by Pastor Bob Thiem in Houston. I liked him immediately. After studying for a few weeks there, he began a series entitled Cracking the Faith Barrier. This impacted my life more than anything I'd ever heard. This teaching from the Bible literally changed my life and delivered me from depression, insecurity, fear, and gave me God's rest. I believe this is the main message that every Christian needs to hear and apply to his or her life. I devoured his message and studied it night and day. I made it my own. Several years later, I wrote a book about this teaching entitled Combat Faith. We're heading for some terrible trials and tests in these final days before Christ comes for us. This will help you to stand for the Lord and bravely do His work with assurance and joy in these final days of the church age. Here then is a synopsis from Combat Faith. I was fascinated during those days to watch the movie The Right Stuff. It perfectly illustrated my favorite Bible teaching about faith, especially the part about the daring young men who risked their lives to crack through the seemingly impenetrable barrier posed by the speed of sound. As pilots approached that speed, great turbulence built up against the airplane. The air literally couldn't get out of the way fast enough and piled up in front of the leading edges of the aircraft, causing violent buffeting. This also caused aerodynamic changes in the airflow over the control surfaces, which in turn made the craft almost impossible to control. In those early days, they just did not know how to design the aircraft for supersonic flight. Sometimes the controls froze and became inoperable. At other times, the controls reversed their functions. Some brave men died in the conquest of what became known as the sound barrier. Then one day, a World War II ace fighter pilot named Chuck Yeager climbed into the cockpit of a little experimental rocket-powered aircraft dubbed the Bell X-1, which was slung under the belly of a B-29 bomber. High up in the stratosphere, he dropped clear. He was thrown back against the seat as he ignited the rocket engines and rapidly accelerated toward what the test pilots had nicknamed the demon that lurks at the speed of sound. As Yeager approached the speed of sound, the plane began to shake violently. It seemed that it would disintegrate at any second. The control stick shook so violently that Chuck could hardly hold it still. Just as it seemed the aircraft would rip apart, there was a loud boom and all became quiet and serene inside the cockpit. The buffeting stopped. The controls responded again, and the Mach meter had zoomed past Mach 1. Yeager had at last cracked through the phantom sound barrier in sustained flight. Then he had the strangest experience. He was flying smooth and stable, and the screaming noise and violent air was left behind as he bolted toward the dark blue of the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. There were still great pressures on the outside of the little craft, but the turbulent air had shifted from the leading edge to the rear. Years before, Pastor Thiem had used this phenomena to illustrate the tremendous spiritual experience of how to break from going by human resources and emotions and switching over to faith in God's promises alone. I have never forgotten it. It impacted my life like a bolt from heaven. He demonstrated how there are some amazing parallels between cracking the sound barrier and cracking what he called, the faith barrier. Each believer has to crack the faith barrier, which is also very difficult to penetrate. Though it takes a great deal of speed to crack the sound barrier, to crack the faith barrier, we must stand still and exert no human effort at all while we just trust God. This defies all previous human experience, which is what makes it so difficult to learn. We must learn to wholly depend upon God and not self. When we approach the faith barrier, there are great pressures and turbulences that fight against our feelings and experiences. All our lives, we have sought to cope with problems by our own limited strength and understanding. The resistance comes because we continue to try and cope with the same old human means we have used all our lives. It is extremely difficult to stop trying and simply believe the Lord's promises. But when we crack through the faith barrier, we find on the other side the most wonderful experiences of all, God's rest. It's an inner peace and strength that defies all external circumstances. Even though the pressure and the problems still exist, there's peace and assurance inside our hearts. Amazing works are produced through us while we are resting in the Lord, because it is not our efforts that are the source, but the Holy Spirit's. Cracking the faith barrier illustrates the most essential technique that we must practice each day. It is basic to living a victorious and fruitful life for the Lord. I had to crack the faith barrier to become a writer. It is an unnatural skill for me that God had to produce in me on the other side of the faith barrier. That's why all the glory goes always to God. I'll be back with more in just a moment.